Welcome to the Ghost Talkers podcast, the show dedicated to unsolved history and paranormal mystery. Each week, we delve into something new, from true ghost stories to conversations with psychics, authors, historians, and the dead. If you're scared right now, it's probably because you just listened to Ghost Talkers podcast.
Well, Troy, I know you're author and founder of the American Ghost Society. Do you call yourself a ghost hunter or a ghost investigator, or what would you call yourself?
That's a good question. Actually, I guess I do refer to myself as a ghost hunter. But really, I guess researcher would be more accurate, because the tack that I take with ghost hunting is less about equipment and gadgets and more about history, because I think that by combining the two, that's really the best evidence that you can get of an actual haunting, by taking the events that have happened in the past and being able to connect them to events that are going on now. I think really that's really the key to real evidence of ghosts and hauntings and of the paranormal. So I guess researcher probably would be a better word, or ghost historian. I don't know. There's several different ways you could go with that, but that's the way I look at it.
Man after my own heart, I'll tell you. That's how I go about it too, Troy, and I think that's the way to do it. I mean, you need the historical background to validate what's going on now.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a great way to go about it.
Tell us how you go about your investigations. Do you have a team that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, when you come to, a standard investigation, as in, somebody gives you a call and says, hey, we think our house is haunted, wondered if you would come and, see what you think. Usually I work with a group of 4 or 5 people at a time, and, we come in and, just like, pretty much probably most people do their investigations, we come in looking for, evidence of any kind of activity that the people are reporting. Now, we usually come into it with the idea that it's probably, unfortunately, it's probably not a ghost. There's probably a logical explanation for it. I will admit to you that I am an optimistic skeptic. I come in hoping that maybe something will turn up, but I'm not looking for it to. I'm looking for a natural explanation first. And so that's what we really look for. If people are reporting, doors that open and close by themselves, we're, leveling, checking the levels of the floor, and or looking for windows that might be open that cause a breeze, et cetera. We try to get people to, explain and reproduce what's going on. But, that's one of the things. You come in as as an optimistic skeptic, and a lot of times you leave thinking, there may really be something to this. Or, something occurs during the time that you're there that just can't be explained away. So now you've got something on your hands that may be an actual haunting. And at that point, that's where, in a case like this, where, the history comes into it for us, because that's when I begin, really researching the history of the location, the details, behind the house, who lived there, what happened there in the past, et cetera. Now, I go into it a lot of times when I'm just writing about locations, and, the history is, again, so important. And so that's kind of a different type of thing for me. I tend to wear 2 hats. One is the kind of the ghost hunter going out doing research, investigating people's haunted houses, and then there's the side of me where I'm investigating the history and writing about the location. So, I kind of do 2 different things, and, my books are kind of show that. I have kind of a schizophrenic library, I guess you would say. One hand, it's how-to books on ghost hunting. On the other hand, it's just historical stories and of hauntings. So and the investigation sometimes becomes sort of the same way too.
And I know your website is massive too, Troy. You have all the states are represented in as far as ghostly stories, and a lot of the various types of hauntings. All the various types of hauntings are on your website. So I think it's well worth somebody to look it up on the internet, because there's a wealth of fascinating stories that you have collected on that website. So congratulations.
It's something that'll keep you busy for a while. But part of that is a combination of there's been a lot of work put into it, but it's also a combination of that it's 11 years old, and in internet years are kind of like dog years, when you go back 11 years on the internet, that makes you really, really old. So it just kind of tends to pile up over time, and it just keeps getting bigger as my web server guy keeps reminding me. So it gets a little ugly in October, when he's, complaining about the fact that, we're eating up all the servers. So, that's the way it goes.
Oh, gosh. Well, I love your website, too, and that's at prairieghost.com. Well, I want to get into how you confirm your findings. So, Troy, I love your website. Do you ever use any of these stories in your books, or you just keep these specifically for the website?
No, I mean, the stuff that's on the website, I don't, I've never been one of those people who's been real keen on allowing people, just, random web surfers to submit material to the website. I found not that I have anything against the stories or leads that people bring me, but I found that when you let people post the stories themselves, that unfortunately you come up with a lot of really inaccurate material, because it'll be something that, they heard somewhere along the line, and so, they post it the way they heard it, which is fine. I mean, that's always a great start. It's a great lead, but oftentimes, people see that and they take it as gospel and think that that's the accurate story. So most of the material on the website is stuff that I've either put together from research I've done, or something that's been passed along to me that I've tried to verify as best I can, or an excerpt from a book. So the stuff on the website, a lot of the things on the website will never be used for anything other than, they're a little entertainment on the website. But you'll find a lot of the stories are things that I have either taken from my books, or I will put into a book and then expand and enlarge it, as I'm doing the actual writing.
So how do you research for your books? How much of it is primary research and secondary research, like firsthand experience and what you've heard?
Well, actually, I usually do it the other way around. I usually will hear a story about a place from somewhere, whether it's somebody passes it on to me, or I run across a newspaper article or a magazine article or something like that, and we'll get interested in the location. And then that's when I usually will go out, after doing some, historical research, and then I try to go to the location and actually talk to somebody who's been there, who's worked there, who knows something about it firsthand, or hopefully has had some sort of ghostly experience with the location. So, there's so many sources out there that are so untapped. I ran across something the other day that I thought was interesting. Somebody was talking about how, they see that, that we often talk about the same locations over and over and over again, when there's so many, little-known locations all around out there. And see, that's something that, that I have great respect for Mark for, because he took, these places like, say, at Gettysburg, that are places that, everybody knows. Yeah, he did those a long time ago. He took care of that. He already handled those. Now he's moved on to places that a lot of people don't know about, and that's one of the things that I try to do. That was when I started writing in Illinois. There wasn't a single Illinois ghost book anywhere. Every story was something new. So it was one of those things where it was really exciting to get to do that. But as you expand and go further, you find, well, somebody else has written about it, or, somebody else knows about it. And that's often a great lead, but I never want to lean too hard on anybody else's, material, because there's so much that's out there that's so unknown that we really have a long, long way to go before we cover everything. So, when I say I've written, X number of books, man, I got 1 million more. So they're still coming.
Great.
That's good to hear.
And Troy, I'm sure the same thing has happened to you. I mean, you go to investigate one haunting or try and track down a story, and all of a sudden 2 or 3 more pop up.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I'm sure that when you wrote your first book, as you said, there were virtually no other stories available, and all of a sudden you probably started getting phone calls from people and letters from people. Once that first book goes out, people realize, I'm not crazy.
Right.
And then they seem to just they flow in. Then after that, does that happen to you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then of course, then you find that things that you put in that first book were of course not complete because you thought that was the end of the story, and then you find that was just the beginning of the story. So you find that, but then you're right. You get so many new locations that people start popping up with new stuff all the time. So that's really really exciting, I think.
Yeah. Well, now this is Laine. I wanted to ask you this question, but I'm going to ask you right now. Do you use psychics or sensitives in your work when you go out in the field?
Not very often, but sometimes.
No.
The reason why is because here in my area, I've only found a couple of people that I really thought were reliable. Now, I've tried to work with a couple of people that, who came in and started spinning some really interesting yarns that had absolutely nothing to do with, any of the actual history of the location and that kind of thing. And, I really kind of got really just kind of burned out on the whole idea. But then I've come along and met a couple of different people who I really think, do have something, authentic to offer. One of them is a guy Rob Conover.
That's who came to mind. I was going to ask you.
Because Rob's pretty close to me, and we've actually been able to do some stuff together. And some of the stuff he came up with, I took him to a couple of locations that I knew inside and out that he didn't know anything about at all, and I mean absolutely nothing. And yet he was able to take me to all these different spots and go, well, this is what's going on here. This is what I'm seeing here. This is who's there, and every time it was right on the money. And so that that hasn't been really a lot from my experience. So that was something good that happened with that. Then I have another friend who is in the Chicago area who I work with a lot up there, and he's the same way. Comes up with some really, eerily accurate stuff that, he really shouldn't know because he's one of those guys who does not have a head for history. He will, talk about things and, and really doesn't know, doesn't keep track of the history of it. He leaves that up to me. And so when he comes up with something like that, that really matches, it's impressive.
Well, Rob when he was in Gettysburg, he was really just overwhelmed. I mean, he was speechless. And Rob.
That doesn't happen very often. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was just so much there. And you could see the bewilderment on his face when he was out on that battlefield.
Yeah,
and it got to the point where he just overloaded. He just couldn't. He couldn't absorb anymore.
Yeah.
And he is a remarkable sensitive. There's no doubt about it. And we interviewed him for our podcast.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so his interview is available. But
he's on our third podcast, and he told us some amazing stories. I want to ask you, what is your favorite place to investigate of all the places you've investigated before?
No, that's actually an easy question. I have places that I like to go back to. I mean, all over. But one place that I never ever get tired of investigating, and the beauty of it is that it's like a mile from my house, and it's the old Lincoln Theater in Decatur, Illinois. We have most of our events there. We have our conference there every year. And it's one of those places that I literally grew up in as a kid. It was an old movie theater when I was a kid. And even back then, everybody talked about the fact that it was haunted. And this was while I was interested in ghosts, but of course wasn't doing any writing or investigating or anything. That had come along for a long time afterward. But, growing up, it was just one of those places that I just loved to go. And it closed down in 1980, and it was abandoned for about 10 years, and then has been slowly being restored over the last, since around 1990 or so. So we're, go close to like last 16, 17 years. And it's one of those places where I've gone I wish I could tell you how many times. I lost count a long time ago as to how many. It'd be like asking Mark how many times he's been out on the battlefield. It's one of those kind of things. I've been there so many times, so many investigations, and while there are many times when nothing happens, more often than not, someone will have some sort of experience that can't be explained there, and they'll happen at any time. It doesn't necessarily have to be during an investigation or a ghost tour or anything like that. I mean, there have been times we've been there where we'll be actually having an event and people in the audience, just sitting out in the auditorium in the seats, will claim that somebody has, pulled their hair or tugged on their clothes. Or one woman who came and told me about how she was sitting and someone was kicking the back of her seat, like a kid kicking on the back of her seat, and it was driving her crazy. She turned around, telling them to knock it off, and, of course, there's nobody sitting behind her. And these kind of things happen there regularly. I've been there for the television shows where I'm there kind of, introducing people to the place. And a cameraman and I had an experience where we were up on this metal spiral staircase and heard someone climbing up the staircase, and we thought it was one of the crew that was with us, and there was nobody there. In fact, there wasn't anybody even close to that part of the building. And this was a guy who just did not believe in ghosts prior to this, and but had the guts to say that he didn't believe in ghosts before, but that the Lincoln Theater had made him a believer. So it's my favorite spot, and I've written about it. I said countless times, and we have our big events and stuff there, just because it's an ideal location for just about anything.
Well, when you get to know a site, that helps, and also when it's a controlled area. In other words, you have out on the battlefield, you may hear gunshots, but if it's around the beginning of deer season, but in that type of controlled environment, you can, and when you get to know it that well, you can really have a lot of fun with that. So I gotta have to come out and visit you sometime, Troy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
These places, yeah.
So your Halloween Spooktacular is going to be there this year on the 27th of October?
Yeah. That's for the last 13 years we've been doing something every Halloween weekend, and this year we thought it'd be fun to do what we're calling our Spooktacular, which is kind of a smaller version of our Haunted America Conference kind of thing. But yeah, it's at the Lincoln Theater. We wouldn't miss it. In fact, it's on the anniversary of opening day of the theater, which was October 27th, but of 1916, of course. So yeah, we're having it on the anniversary. So it'll be a lot of fun.
Oh, that's great. That sounds like fun. Wish I could be there.
We're a little busy in getting.
In October. I know.
Have you ever been on an investigation and realized that it was more than you bargained for, or that there was something evil there rather than ghostly? Do you ever have that?
Not really. I've had times when I've been. I don't know if it was something that I that didn't bargain for, but there have been plenty of times where I've been scared. And a couple of times when I've actually left. One of the things one of the cardinal rules you always tell everybody, never do this by yourself because you just never know what might happen, and it doesn't necessarily mean because of the ghosts. We always like to say we're more afraid of the living than the dead. So it's just not a good idea to go by yourself. But of course, I've done it. Too many, more times than I should probably admit to. But usually, I do it, in the context of I'm going as a writer, not as a ghost hunter. I'm not going so I can set up equipment and everything. I'm going so that I can write about the location. And a couple of times I've gone and have left. One night I decided I was going to spend the night in this old cemetery that was supposed to be haunted. And I'd been there probably a dozen times, and nothing about it had ever bothered me. We'd had some weird things that had happened, but, it was always in the context of an investigation, and so it was just, that was weird stuff that happened. And then one night I decided I was going to camp out there and stay all night, and I made it 45 minutes. Now, whether or not that was just my imagination running away from me, it was certainly a possibility, but whatever it was, I wasn't staying around to find out. I had a similar experience at the Bell Witch Cave in Tennessee, and again, it's one of those places that I've been to probably a dozen times, known the owners for years, great people. We bring tours there. I mean, it's a great place. And a few years ago, I was there with a film crew, and I decided that it would be a good idea if I went to the back of the cave by myself. So I decided to give it a shot and walked to the back of the cave and made it about 3.5 minutes before I just realized I need to get the hell out of here, and I left.
Well, what happened?
So I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain why. It was just these overwhelming feelings that I needed to leave. And I'll be honest with you, and I say this all the time, I am as psychic as a fence post. I mean, I have absolutely no psychic abilities whatsoever. There could be a ghost standing right behind me, rattling chains right now. I wouldn't know it. Now, that's not to say that I don't have, experiences and strange things that happen, but I got to tell you, I'm convinced they're by accident. I accidentally experience ghosts because I just, I don't have any of that kind of thing going on. But for some reason, there have been a few times that, and I think even the most unpsychic people sometimes get a feeling, I don't know what you want to call it, but some sort of sense that, that something here is not right. And, yeah, I've had that happen to me a few times, and I wouldn't say it was anything evil, but whatever it was, it convinced me to, get my act together and get out of there. So
same thing used to happen to me when I was a park ranger. We'd be on night patrol, and we were all by ourselves. And I would go through Devil's Den. We'd get around the battlefield maybe 3 times during the course of an 8-hour shift at night. And we'd stop and get out at Devil's Den and walk around all by ourselves. You got a gun and you got a radio. Nothing really should scare you.
Right.
And then there were a couple of times when I'd be driving through and I'd be, Jesus, a nice night. Maybe I'll get out and walk around. And there you get the willies.
Yeah.
When you try and make that decision that you're going to do this, and all of a sudden the hair on the back of your neck stands up, and you're like, well, maybe next time.
yeah, maybe next time around. Yeah.
So I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, you can't really put your finger on it, but it's just something that tells you, nah, not now.
Yeah, not now. Yeah.
Well, can you tell us your favorite story?
If I have to pick a favorite of all the stuff I've ever researched, investigated, written about, whatever, my favorite story is undoubtedly Resurrection Mary, which is a classic Illinois story.
Oh, it's great. Yeah.
So it's a story that a lot of people are familiar with because you start off by telling them, well, it's sort of a vanishing hitchhiker story, and they go, yeah, we've got one of those. We've got one of them down, around the road near us where this woman, gets a ride in a car and always disappears. We've heard that. And I said, well, you may have heard yours, but you haven't heard the real one because Resurrection Mary is the vanishing hitchhiker story, and it's one of the only stories of that type, the only one I know of really that has, a real places, real dates, real people, connected to it. It's not a friend of a friend who, picked up this woman on this road one night. It's, this particular person on August 10th, 1976, picked up a young woman in white on this roadway, and she disappeared from the car. I mean, the story behind him and the legend behind Resurrection Mary is that she's connected to a roadway on the southwest side of Chicago called Archer Avenue. And along Archer Avenue is an old, now it's old, of course, dance hall called the Willowbrook Ballroom. Back in the 30s, it was known as the O. Henry Ballroom. And the story is that this young girl went there one night for a holiday dance with her boyfriend. They got into an argument, and she left the O. Henry and started walking north on Archer Avenue, and she was struck and killed by a hit-and-run driver, and she died. And her parents buried her at Resurrection Cemetery, but she didn't stay there for very long. Soon there were reports of a young woman being seen along the roadway, hitching rides or appearing alongside the road. People would give her a ride, would travel north along Archer Avenue, and she would always disappear when they reached the gates to Resurrection Cemetery, or she would ask to be let out, would walk toward the gates and disappear. The story started in around 1934 and continues to this day. And it's been one of those stories that has just kind of fascinated anybody, who's interested in vanishing hitchhikers, and fascinated with anybody who's interested in Chicago area ghosts. But interestingly, I wrote a book about Resurrection Mary that actually came out earlier this year, and started doing a lot of research into the real stories behind it, and found that this legend has been around since the 30s for a really good reason, because there are at least two different candidates as to who Resurrection Mary might be. Now, everybody had always kind of wondered about a couple of them, but I really found some really good history that actually shows, I think, really pretty convincingly, that there are at least two girls who have combined to kind of create this legend. The first one was a young girl whose name was Mary Bergowie, and she was a Polish factory worker who had actually died in 1934, not on Archer Avenue, but she lived near Archer Avenue, and she had actually gone to a dance that night at the O. Henry Ballroom on the night she died, and then had gone downtown to the Loop to stay out to some of the later night clubs, and she was killed on her way home from the dance. And she was killed actually downtown Chicago. Well, her parents buried her at Resurrection Cemetery in an orchid-colored dress, a light kind of purple-colored dress, which was different than the story. But soon after she was buried, one of the caretakers at the cemetery began reporting that he was seeing this young woman in an orchid-colored dress who was barefoot walking around throughout the cemetery. Well, he called the funeral home director, whose name was John Satala, and told him about this ghost sighting. Well, the caretaker immediately knew who it was because he remembered the description of the orchid-colored dress, and he knew that it was Mary Bergowie he'd buried. And he would later go on record to say that he was convinced that it was her ghost. Well, after that, things got even weirder because people who were driving along Archer Avenue, usually on their way to the O. Henry Ballroom, began claiming that they were seeing a young girl in an orchid-colored dress out in front of the cemetery trying to hitch rides with them. And she would try to flag down cars. She would run up beside the cars. Sometimes she would even jump up onto the running boards and try to climb into the back window of these cars as they were going by. Now, what made this even more terrifying, as if that isn't terrifying enough, is that these drivers recognized the woman. They knew her because she was a friend of hers, of theirs when she was alive, and it was Mary Bergowie. So this, I think, is what gave birth to the stories of Resurrection Mary. But what was weird is, while we have this ghost who's appearing out in front of the cemetery like that, it doesn't explain who the blonde woman in white is who's often seen along the road, or so I thought. Now, as I'm doing this research, and I had put out the information a long time ago that I was trying to track down stories of Resurrection Mary and that sort of thing, I got a letter from a woman who told me that she knew who Resurrection Mary was because Resurrection Mary was her babysitter when she was a kid. And and so I'm thinking, oh, well, it's, you just never know. But it was one of those things that piqued my interest, and so I got in touch with this woman. I eventually spoke to her. She was quite old. She's in her late 70s, and her and her brother both I spoke with, who both remembered a babysitter that they had, a woman named Mary Miskowski, who ironically lived just a few blocks away from Mary Bergowie. And Mary, the other Mary, Mary Miskowski, had actually died around the same time as Mary Bergowie. She had been run over on Archer Avenue by a passing car. And what made it interesting was that it was October of 1930. She was on her way to a costume party and was wearing a bridal gown at the time. So whenever these stories started to be told a few years later about this woman in this white dress who'd been seen along Archer Avenue and who was trying to flag down cars like she was on her way somewhere, this elderly woman and her brother both immediately recognized the description as being their old babysitter, Mary Miskowski. So now we had two possible candidates for Resurrection Mary, and the story suddenly went from being just, a story to something that was really, really a possibility. You combine that with some of the first-hand accounts of people who claimed that they had encountered her, who had spent the evening with her, who'd given her rides, and the guy who actually witnessed a young woman in white standing inside of the cemetery in the 1970s and called the police thinking someone had been locked inside. When they came back, they found that these handprints had somehow been burned into the metal of the bars. Combine that with physical evidence, and now you've got a real story on your hands. It's not just a ghost story anymore. I mean, it's something that cannot be easily explained. So you can see why. I mean, it's a complex, it's a complicated story, but I think you can see why it's one of my favorites.
Oh, of course. I mean, the fact that you wrote an entire book on it, I can see how that could happen. I mean, especially if you're doing the research and going back as far as you can. And I'll tell you what this tells me is that indeed is the original story, where a lot of these other stories have spun off. People have heard that story in New York and said, well, I heard this story and I couldn't remember, and it's
sure.
my cousin, and it happened just down the road here in New York. But you've convinced me that I mean, with two of them, two candidates there, my goodness, that's
yeah, and there may be more. I mean, that's two that those are the two, as far as I'm concerned, most likely. There may be others. It's a very weird area. Archer Avenue is very, very strange. A part of the book that I wrote is just other locations along Archer Avenue as well. I mean, there's haunted cemeteries, haunted buildings, haunted churches. I mean, there's just along this one particular roadway. And the road has kind of a weird history anyway. It was just an Indian trail originally, and it was turned into a road to follow the path of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. And it was just a road that was used by the workers, and eventually it turned into kind of a major highway on Chicago's southwest side. And for some reason, there's just a lot of activity along that particular road. And so, I mean, really, Resurrection Mary really seems to be kind of a perfect addition to all of the weirdness that's going along on that same highway. But she's, of course, the main the main bit of weirdness on that road, and probably wouldn't be as active if she was anywhere else. So,
well, there's that history again, that you've researched of Archer Avenue and how it ties in with some of the hauntings and everything. So that's great. That's good work.
That really is. What a great story. I have chills. So what is the name of the book? Is it Resurrection Mary?
Resurrection Mary, yeah.
And where do I get this book?
We can get it from our website. I mean, you can order it from, Amazon and the regular online people, but of course we prefer that you ordered it from prairieghost.com, but
prairieghost.com. I know our listeners want to know that. Oh, that's great. Speaking of chills, I have to think about Rob Conover again and his amazing stories that he told us. He gave us a story about getting rid of demons in a house. It's really chilling. In fact, when I was editing it, I was editing about 3 in the morning, and I had to stop. It was too much for me to take. And I know you and Rob are good friends and have worked together, and this story actually came from a referral from you. You asked Rob to go over and take a look at this house.
Yeah, I do that quite a bit, yeah.
Well, I'm wondering how do you differentiate between a haunting and something really a lot more sinister?
Well, I send him often in both directions. I mean, it could be something very, innocuous where people, when people come to me and say, oh, we've got all this activity going on, we really, we really don't want somebody to come investigate it. We just want it to be gone, and I said, well, let me put you in touch with Rob. I mean, that's normally what I do. And then other cases where, we'll be involved in an investigation. It's an ongoing thing, and, we really think there's something to it. I mean, I try not to send him on, wild goose chases as much as possible. But whenever, something comes up and we really think it's something, legitimate, and they would like the activity to be gone, then, again, I refer them to Rob. But I don't really pick and choose as far as I don't say, oh, well, this sounds, he'll be glad to hear this. This sounds really dangerous. Let's send Rob. I don't really do it that way. It just, sometimes it happens that way. But I know that, he's had some interesting things that have come from referrals, and usually it's kind of the crazier the better. Not necessarily the people being crazy, but the activity they're talking about is really crazy, and that's usually, right up Rob's alley. So, I tend to kind of, refer those cases to him.
Yeah. Well, I know what you're talking about with people just not knowing. I get called a lot to come out to houses, And, you know, a lot of the times people just want to see a psychic in action, and sometimes they really have something serious.
Mm-hmm.
But I try to get them to handle it themselves because they need to take control of things.
Sure.
And there's this one woman who, she called me and she called another psychic I work with about 8 times, and she was just so scared. So I thought, okay, we'll go and do this. So we get to her house, and in fact, she did have a ghost, and he was not very nice. But she had no idea that she had this ghost in her house. What she kept referring to was what we figured out was her air conditioning coughing. You know, when the heater would come on, it would make strange noises, and
right.
You know, and up here in Maryland, you use them back and forth, you know.
Right, right.
So, yeah, that was something else.
Well, you have to, you know, one of the things that Troy reminded me of is when he does his investigations, you start to rule out all the normal things that it could be, and that when it really gets weird is when you've ruled out all the normal, then you're stuck with the paranormal, you know, and that's what I often tell people. You know, go through all the regular stuff that it could be, you know, air conditioning, you know, leaves blowing against the window, and which may, you know, this may be the reason why so many people think houses are especially haunted in the fall. Well, you have leaves blowing against the windows, you have bare branches scratching against the side of the house, you know. You have to check all that stuff out before you can, you know, you can really declare it haunted. But and I'm sure, Troy, you've run into the same thing like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, plenty of times. And, you know, and there have been plenty of times where, you know, we've come in and been kind of suckered into it ourselves. You know, the people are so convincing and are so sure that the place is haunted, you know, and, you know, you hear what they're talking about, and then you start hearing what they're hearing, which is never good, you know. I mean, I had a case, it's been a number of years ago now. I was living down in the Alton, Illinois area, and I'd gotten a call from these people who, you know, were sure that their attic was haunted. And interestingly, the woman that lived there had actually done some research into the history of the house herself and had found some pretty legitimate stuff. Apparently, the original owner had lived there, had built the house around the turn of the century, had lived there for about 25, 30 years, and that had lost his farm during the Depression and had actually gone up to the attic and committed suicide. He'd hung himself in the attic, and nobody found him for about 2 weeks. And so, I mean, you know, here's a, you know, this sounds like a great, you know, a great opportunity for a haunting. And they were convinced that every night when it got dark, that he was up there walking around, and they clearly heard these footsteps walking around. So I, you know, agreed to come out and, you know, take a look or take a listen, as it were, and went out to the house, gathered with the entire family, of course, in the upstairs bedroom where there was a drop-down ladder staircase up to the attic. And just shortly after it got dark, I mean, we could plainly hear somebody walking around upstairs. I mean, something heavy moving around. So I tried to get this woman's husband to go up there with me. He wouldn't go. So it was just me and a flashlight, and I went up the stairs, peered over the edge of the attic to look around, and saw not one ghost but 2. They were big gray raccoons. And they were walking around in the attic because, being nocturnal, they would wake up every night and decide that it was time to go outside and go looking for food. And they would forage around and move around in the attic. But here you go. I mean, here was a case of where you had this interesting story. You'd convinced yourself that the house was haunted. And believe me, I was well on my way to believing it as I was sitting there listening to these footsteps, you know, moving around in the attic. And instead it turned out to be a couple of raccoons. But so, I mean, it happens, you know, it happens, and it happens more often than you think. I mean, I like to think if that guy, you know, if this woman's husband had a little bit more, you know, stamina, maybe, you know, a lot of trouble could have been saved, but he was terrified. You know, the whole family was. The kids were scared. She was scared. Everybody was scared. And, yeah, it was raccoons. So,
yeah,
you know, so it happens.
Yeah, that happens. Well, Troy, let me ask you something about, because you're the Midwest guru. I mean, of ghost stories. You've collected more ghost stories in the Midwest than anybody I can think of. And and one of the things that I noticed, because I collected a lot about Gettysburg, and now we're doing the Fredericksburg area. And one of the things that I noticed is that there's a difference. Of all the stories I've collected at Gettysburg, only about 10 or 11% are visuals, and about 60% or 61% are auditory. I go to Fredericksburg, and from the stories that I've collected so far, twice that many are visuals. Now, I'm looking for a scientific explanation for this rather than a cultural one, and I might be off base, but I realize that water has a lot to do with loaning energy to entities. So they say. So I've read. And, you have the Rappahannock River right there, right next to Fredericksburg. Do you find that, for example, do you get more intense ghost stories, more visuals from around the Great Lakes as opposed to, the prairie area?
Well, I'd have to agree with you on the water thing. And I do agree that although I wish I could say, really one way or the other, because, I find that around the water here anywhere in the Midwest, and we have, and people, think we have a lot more water than people realize around here, from our rivers to our lakes to a lot of underground waters, because anytime you find a farm in the Midwest, you've got an underground water source, because we've got all the wells, we've got all the underground rivers. I mean, my parents lived right directly on top of an underground river. We've been using that same well. Our family's been using that well for, 100 years now. So, I mean, there's a lot of water around, and I think that the water really adds to the hauntings, but I don't find that, but see, I find it really a strong combination of the two, both visual and auditory hauntings connected to water. And I think that the main reason for, at least in the Midwest, the main reason behind that is I wouldn't say that these hauntings that are connected to water here are really an intelligent presence behind them. I wouldn't call them a spirit. I'd just call them a haunting. And in other words, I think a lot of them are recordings, just sort of a recording of a time, time in past, time in history that sort of just imprinted itself on the atmosphere of a place. And, you wonder how that's done. And again, I think it's through water. When you think of all of the things that exist, from trees to bricks to wood, all of it contains a lot of water. And I think that having the energy that expends itself in these locations, whether it be a battlefield or whether it be, an old building here in the Midwest, I think that the impression that these events leave in that water, kind of like a homeopathic medicine. I don't know if you're familiar much with homeopathics, but usually the medicines that are used to treat illnesses using homeopathic medicine, the medicines themselves are poisonous. I mean, they'll kill you if you take it straight. So that's why they put them into water and distill them to the point that there's really no medicine left. Only the impression of the medicine is left behind, and that's what they use to treat people with. I think hauntings are much the same way. Things happen. They imprint themselves on this water that's based in or either underground or a river or actually just based in the bricks of a location. And that haunting, that event, just sort of leaves a little bit of itself behind, which explains why so many of them fade away over time. But I think water plays a much more important role in hauntings than we've ever given it credit to before. So that may explain why things in Fredericksburg for you seem so much more intense, because either it's a much stronger recording or the spirits really just are more attracted to water, which again makes sense because water is is conducive to magnetics and to electronics and
Sure.
And so it would be much easier for them to manifest, I think, around water. So so I know I didn't answer your question because I don't know. I don't know if I've got an answer, but I do know that the water I think is very important.
You did answer my question. I mean, I just wanted I just wanted to, your opinion, which I value on something like that, because when you collect as many stories as you have, you start to see patterns. I mean,
sure.
And that's that. If you've noticed it too, then that definitely gives me something to work with here. But that's great. That's good to hear. So
that is interesting. Because Mark and I were just talking the other day. I'm working on a book right now, and I was not an investigative medium or a medium my entire life. It's just been the past few years since we moved to Maryland into this house that's on an old plantation. It's very haunted, and we have a lake, about a 1,000-acre lake that runs around behind our house, and then we have lakes on the other two sides. And I hadn't thought about it in that way. Maybe it's the water.
Yeah, that's very possible. It makes a lot of sense.
Because we have, I can't get a picture without a ghost in it. I try to take pictures of my kids. It doesn't work.
Laine showed me some pictures yesterday, Troy. You'd be fascinated by them. There's some weird faces. The same face of a woman in 2 or 3 different photos, 4 or 5 different photos.
Wow.
And she just appears, and it's really interesting. You probably enjoy doing an investigation.
Yeah, I think it sounds like it.
Yeah, the last time I had another psychic over here, we were having doors opening and closing and all kinds of weird stuff. This glowing ball would chase my dog around, and in the backyard I'd look outside, he'd be running from this glowing ball. It was wild, but it happens to be a little girl who's here, and she just has a red ball that she likes. It was scary at first before I figured that out.
Yeah.
I left Mark downstairs one night alone in the dark because I couldn't take it. Remember that, Mark?
Yep.
You were talking about the cave, and I thought, I've left Mark down there, and he's like, where are you going? I'm out of here.
Well, speaking of caves now, the Bell Witch Cave, you obviously have gone there a number of times, and that's a fascinating story about how it seems to be one of the more documented and more actually horrific hauntings. This poor family was hounded by the Bell Witch. I think everybody's fairly familiar with the story, but could you give us maybe a brief synopsis of it? And then
because a lot of people are familiar with the story, but aren't familiar with how the cave really fits into the story. Kind of in a nutshell, the Bell Witch was actually a ghost, a spirit that haunted the John Bell family in Middle Tennessee from 1817 to 1821. The haunting was very violent, witnessed by literally hundreds upon hundreds of people, dozens and dozens of whom actually signed, affidavits that went on file as to what they saw, what they experienced, seeing things move about, seeing people beaten and slapped, pushed. Probably the 2 biggest targets of the spirit. And again, we really don't know why. We don't even know why that the ghost haunted this family. But she was really, and I say she because everybody referred to her as Old Kate, but she was really just sort of a malevolent presence that was able to cause activity to move around and a voice. She really wasn't an actual apparition. Nobody saw her, but she was a voice that really haunted the family. And probably the 2 biggest targets was Betsy or Elizabeth Bell, who was John Bell's daughter, and John Bell himself. The witch hated John Bell and would never tell anyone why, but she pretty much kept him sick and beaten and worn down for 4 years before she killed him. And she took credit for actually causing his death. And in the paranormal annals of an American history, it's the only case where a ghost actually caused the death of someone who was involved. So I think for that reason, even though it's a case that really dates back many, many years, in a very rural area, I think that this is the reason why we're so familiar with it over time. But the cave itself plays kind of an interesting part in the story. There's only a few instances in the records of the Bell Witch haunting where the cave comes up. The cave was really used by the family as a place to store, meat and butter and that sort of thing during the summertime because it does stay very cool. And it was also a case where a couple of the kids had sort of encountered the spirit in the cave on one occasion. So it wasn't something that played a really big part of the story, but local tradition has it that when the Bell Witch left the Bell family for good in 1821, that she went into this cave because of all the strange things that have happened there. Now, what I find interesting about the cave is that it's built directly below, the mouth of the cave is directly below, in a side of a bluff, an Indian burial ground. The cave is right underneath it. And I've always thought that burial ground does kind of play a role in the story. This is another case that I wrote an entire book about. There aren't very many where I write an entire book about the cave. The Bell Witch, the St. Louis Exorcism, Resurrection Mary, and the Watsika Wonder, which is a book I've got coming out here in October. These are cases that I find that there was so much good material and so many things that are, that you could actually discover about the case that they warranted an entire book. So the cave itself is probably a good third of the book because of all the strange things that have happened there. People have seen things, they've heard things, they've been sort of not necessarily attacked like the Bells were, but people have been pushed and shoved and slapped, and it's a very active place, and it remains very active. I'm usually there a couple times a year at least. And, to this day, some really weird things go on there. I've always listed the cave as one of the most haunted places in America. So,
wow.
The book is called Season of the Witch, and it's a book that I wrote that's specifically about the Bell Witch Cave.
Available, Laine, on Troy's website.
That's right.
At prairieghost.com. I was just going to ask if you could tell us a little bit about your 10th anniversary edition of the Ghost Hunter's Guidebook.
Okay. Yeah, the Ghost Hunter's Guidebook actually dates back to 1997. This is when the first edition came out, and at the time there really wasn't anything on the market as far as kind of a how-to guide for ghost hunters. And the first couple editions were really small, and over time it's each edition grows. I do a new edition about every 3 years now, and I find that things change. Things change. New equipment comes along. Old equipment comes back. What seemed like good equipment is no longer really useful. So the book gets updated every few years, and then I did a 10th anniversary edition this year, and the book always gets completely rewritten and updated, and this has been, I think, probably our most popular edition so far. Because it was a 10th anniversary, we did a hardcover edition and a paperback edition, which was kind of cool. It was the first book our company had actually done in hardcover, which was kind of fun. So it gave us something different to try. But yeah, it's the guidebook is just sort of a how-to guide. I mean, and it's not just for beginners. It's for people who are interested in the field, and I gather as much information as I can and put it out there, and with the idea that I'm not an expert. I don't know everything there is to know. This is not the final word on the subject. This is just the best updated how-to stuff I've got, and I've put it together from my own experience. It's all trial and error. There were things in the book that are, I put them in there because they were investigation techniques that I had actually tried out, and if they worked, that's why I put them in there. Sometimes they don't work. I put them in there because they didn't work, so that people can kind of learn from whatever mistakes that I may have made. And I think that there's a lot of really helpful information in there for people. And I never, honestly, of all the books I've written, I've never gotten a complaint about that particular book, because I put it, like I said, I put it out there so that people can use the information, adapt it, and make it work for them. You don't have to take it line by line and say this is how it has to be done. That's not my point. The point is that maybe I can give you some ideas that you can use, and maybe they'll work for you too. So, yeah. So it's a fun book to write.
I think one of the things that you did also, Troy, is you based everything on principles. And when you do that, then, yeah, there may be new Gauss meters that come out or old ones that fall by the wayside, but still the principles are there, and people can say, well, I'm going to try and experiment with something else. And I think that's pretty important because, I mean, 15 years ago there were a handful of people who were actually going out and doing in the field experiments. Now it's grown, not necessarily as a profession, but as a hobby for so many people. If you give them the basic principles, then they're going to experiment on their own, and
right.
I think that helps the field.
Right. I think so too. So yeah, it's a fun book to write, and it's one I always enjoy. And I get a lot of good comments about it, and that really makes it worthwhile when people tell me, hey, I got this book, and I really got something out of it. The way I look, if you get anything out of it, anything at all, if you take one thing out of the book and use it, and it works for you, then I serve my purpose with it. So yeah,
it's a great book.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it. I'd like to read several books by authors before I talk to them, but you've got so many.
Yeah, well, that's a little tough. Yeah, you can't go, I'm going to read all your books before I talk to you. You may call me in, 3-4 years, so,
You may have to start publishing Cliff Notes.
Well, Laine, we do carry a lot of Troy's books in our bookstore at the Ghost of Gettysburg, but I don't think we have the 10th anniversary edition of the Ghost Hunter's Guidebook, so we'll have to pick up a few of those for the Halloween season.
Sure.
Oh, yeah. That's great. Well, do you have any advice for novice ghost hunters or ghost investigators?
Yeah, the advice I always give everybody when they're starting out in ghost hunting, that the best thing that you need to know or need to remember about ghost hunting is the most important tool that you're going to bring to ghost hunting is yourself. Everybody gets very excited about, I'm going to get the latest gadgets that I saw on TV, and I'm going to go out and be a ghost hunter. And, gadgets are not, in my opinion, are kind of the least important of all the things that you can bring to an investigation. But the one thing that you've got to have is, your own knowledge, your own common sense, and, your own thoughts on how you want to do this and how you want to do it and what you want to bring to the field. So that's really the main advice that I give to people. Don't get carried away with equipment just yet. Start out by learning and figuring out, what's going on and how you want to do this and what's the best approach to take to an investigation before you try to bring in, all kinds of other stuff.
Would you say to do your historical research beforehand or maybe afterwards?
I don't like to know too much. If I'm going in to do an investigation, that was one of the things we talked about earlier. If I'm going in to do an investigation at somebody's house, I don't need to know too much going in because that tends to kind of skew. It's kind of like going into the house where the farmer had committed suicide. See, I knew that going in, and so that's what I was looking for. I was looking to try to prove, oh, wait a minute, it must be the farmer. Instead, I'd rather go and find out if there's really something going on first, then go back and look at the historical research and find out what that something that's going on may actually be. So writing about it's a little different. Writing about it, I want to know as much as I can, but when an investigation comes along, I'd much rather not know as much to start with.
It's a little tough because I can't help but, I know Gettysburg fairly well.
Oh, sure.
For me, not to go into that area without some preconceptions, but when it comes to Laine,
yeah, right.
We cloister her before we take her something.
Yeah.
She doesn't even know where we're going.
Yeah.
Most of the time, so.
I know if he says, do you have your inhaler, then I better watch out.
Yeah, then it must be bad, yeah.
This has been great, Troy, and fun and a great interview. You're so interesting.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for talking to us today.
All right, absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Happy to do it. All right, bye.
Thanks.
And thank you to our listeners for listening to Ghost Talkers on ghosttalkers.net. Rest in peace.